He broke a hired gun's wrist before it cleared leather. He swore he'd ride on by morning. He was wrong. This widow would cost him everything, his solitude, his borrowed name, and finally his whole guarded heart. Don't get involved. Ride on. That was the rule, and it had kept him alive through more towns than he could count, more graveyards than he liked to remember. It was about to die on a dirt street in front of a general store, and he would spend the rest of his life glad that it had. He'd ridden into Ambergate a little past noon, meaning to water his mare, buy 2 weeks of supplies, and be gone before the sun dropped behind the ridge. That was the second rule. North, always north, toward nothing in particular, because a man with no name and no home has nowhere in particular to be. Ambergate looked like every dying cattle town he'd passed through that year. Storefronts with paint curling off in strips, a church with a steeple that leaned like it was tired of standing straight, boardwalks with more gaps than boards. The kind of place that had once believed in its own future and had since learned better. He tied his mare outside the mercantile and went to buy his flour and his coffee and his cartridges, and that should have been the whole of his business in Ambergate. Then he saw her. She stood with her back against the mercantile's clapboard wall, and 2 men had boxed her in, not touching her, not yet, but close enough that the threat sat in the air like heat off a stove. One was tall and raw-boned, with an old scar splitting his eyebrow. The other was shorter and thicker, the sort of man who ran to fat the moment nobody made him move. Both wore their guns low and worn, the leather soft with use. The woman herself didn't look frightened. That was the thing that stopped Ash mid-stride. One boot still lifted off the dirt. She looked furious, chin up, spine straight as a fence post, and her voice carried clean across the street. "I said no, Mr. Marlowe, and I'll keep saying it until you develop some capacity for understanding a simple word." Reed Marlowe only smiled. No warmth anywhere in it. "Ledger, that's harsh talk for a woman who ought to be thinking clear. We're only here to help you see reason." Reason. The word tasted of ash in her mouth. "You call threatening my livelihood reason. Your ranch is bleeding money into the dirt. You've got no hands worth the name, no water rights worth fighting over, and winter's coming on hard and early this year. Dunmore's offer is more than generous. It's the last kind thing anybody in this county is going to do for you. Mr. Dunmore can take his generous offer, and careful now." The shorter man stepped close enough that his shadow fell across her boots, his voice dropping to something oily and low. "You're alone out there at Two Rivers, Mrs. Ledger. Accidents happen on ranches, fires, stampedes. All manner of unfortunate circumstance befalls a woman with no man to look after her interests. There's talk, too, of Ambergate's own founding families, of ranches that stood 2 generations before the railroad ever dreamed this far west, quietly changing hands once their owners finally saw reason. Ash was off his horse before he'd made the conscious decision to move. He crossed the street slow and unhurried, boots near silent on the packed dirt, hands loose and empty at his sides, unbuttoning nothing. He didn't need to yet. Something in the way he carried himself made both men turn, their hands dropping toward their holsters out of pure animal instinct before their minds caught up with a reflex. His voice stayed quiet, almost friendly. "Seems to me the lady already gave you her answer." Marlowe's eyes narrowed, cataloging him fast. The trail dust ground into a duster, gone the color of old rust, a face weathered brown by sun and wind, eyes that didn't blink often and gave away nothing when they didn't. The kind of man you saw pinned to a wanted poster board, or woke from remembering in a cold sweat. This ain't your business, friend. Didn't say it was. But you're blocking the walk. Makes it hard for decent folk to go about their day. The shorter one laughed, forced and thin. You got sand, stranger, but you're new around here. Don't know how things work in this county. Then educate me. Something in his tone made the laughter die on the man's lips. Marlowe studied him a long moment, weighing the odds the way men who'd survived a few gunfights always did, and didn't much like the number he came up with. Fine. He spread his hands wide, like a man conceding a hand of cards he never planned to win. We'll let the lady think on Mr. Dunmore's offer a while longer. But it won't stay on the table forever, Catherine, Cora. He caught himself, a thin smile playing at the correction, like the slip of her dead husband's pet name for her was a small cruelty he'd saved on purpose. And things have a way of getting harder for folks who take too long deciding. He turned to go, and that was when he made his mistake. His hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip, more habit than intention, the kind of gesture a man makes to reassure himself of his own advantage. Ash's hand moved faster than thought. He caught Marlowe's wrist and turned it, one clean, economical motion, and Marlowe's knees buckled with a grunt of pain before his gun had cleared 2 inches of leather. I wouldn't. He let go just as fast as he'd taken hold, stepping back with his hands open again, as if nothing at all had happened. Marlowe straightened, cradling his wrist, his face gone the color of old brick. You'll regret this, stranger. The words came out thin instead of threatening, a boast with the air already let out of it. Then he and his partner mounted up and rode off toward the ridge road, and the street let out a breath it had been holding. Cora Ledger looked at the man who just planted himself between her and 2 of Everett Dunmore's guns, and for the first time since her husband's funeral, something other than grief and fury moved across her face. Her voice stayed careful. The voice of a woman who'd learned that kindness in this county usually arrived with a price tag attached. You didn't have to do that. No, I didn't. He touched his hat brim, already turning back toward his horse, already reaching for the second rule, the one about riding on, the one that had never once failed him. And that should have been the end of it, a stranger's good deed on a dying street, forgotten by both of them within the week. It wasn't. Because Cora Ledger's eyes were red-rimmed in a way that had nothing to do with the wind, and Ash had spent 11 years learning to read the particular grief of a woman who'd buried somebody she loved. He found himself standing in the street a moment longer than the transaction required. You've got trouble. It wasn't a question. Cora studied him, the trail dust, the 2 Colts worn low and easy on his hips, the way he'd moved like water finding the fastest path downhill. More trouble than I know what to do with. My husband's dead 6 weeks. Killed in what the sheriff calls a riding accident, though Sam Ledger could ride a horse in his sleep, and everybody in this county knows it. And a man named Everett Dunmore wants my ranch bad enough that his hired guns won't stop asking nicely a while longer before they stop asking at all. There was no plea in it, no bid for pity, only plain fact laid flat on the table between them, and something about that plainness was what finally undid him. He should have ridden north that afternoon. He weighed it twice while he stood there, and both times some other part of him, the part that had gone quiet and cold for 11 years, Ever since a war and a betrayal had taught him not to trust his own softer instincts, refused to listen. My name's Ash. It was a lie of omission more than an outright falsehood, since it was the only name he'd used in over a decade, and I've got nowhere in particular to be. If you'll feed a stranger supper, ma'am, I'll hear the rest of that trouble. Cora studied him another long moment, weighing a decision that would change the shape of both their lives, though neither of them knew it. And you can call me Cora. Nobody around here bothers with Mrs. Ledger, except the men trying to steal from me. Ambergate itself told the story before Cora ever opened her mouth to finish it. A town that had once shipped more cattle east than any crossing for 50 miles in either direction, now had half its storefront shuttered, its bank the only building freshly painted, its saloon quieter by dusk than it had any right to be in cattle country. The railroad survey stakes had gone in along the river road that spring, orange flags snapping in the wind like a promise nobody in Ambergate had been asked whether they wanted kept. Everett Dunmore's name was stitched through every conversation in that dying town, the way rot runs through a fence post, invisible from the outside until the whole thing gave way under a man's boot. 2 rivers sat 4 miles east of town, a modest spread of good grass and better water, where the Sable and Elm Creeks braided together before spilling into the wider river beyond. It had been Sam Ledger's inheritance, built up over 9 years of careful, unglamorous work, a solid house, a barn that had taken 2 summers to raise, corrals mended so many times they'd become a patchwork of old wood and new. Cora laid out the story over a supper of beans and cornbread and better coffee than Ash had tasted in months, and the shape of it was uglier than even Marlowe's threats had suggested. Everett Dunmore had come to this county 3 years back, with railroad money behind him, and a plan that only made sense once you understood the whole of it. The Cascade Southern line was pushing west, and the survey routes ran straight through a dozen family ranches along the river, 2 rivers chief among them. Dunmore's plan wasn't complicated, only patient. Buy what could be bought cheap, bankrupt what couldn't, frighten what wouldn't bankrupt. And where frightening failed, Cora's voice went flat and hard on this part, arrange an accident. 3 ranching families had already sold out under pressure that summer, moving on to somewhere Dunmore's reach didn't extend. A 4th family, the Hollisters, had lost their eldest son to a fall from a barn roof that nobody who'd known him climbing that roof his whole life quite believed was an accident. And 6 weeks ago, Sam Ledger had ridden out to check the north fence line and never ridden back. Found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine his horse would never in 100 years have carried him near. Sheriff Boone calls it misfortune. There was a bitterness in the word that laid bare everything Ash needed to know about the sheriff's arrangement with Everett Dunmore. I call it murder, and I can't prove a word of it. And every week that passes without proof is another week. Dunmore's men come around reminding me how unfortunate it would be if something similar happened to me. She looked at him across the table, and there was no performance in it, no calculation. Only a woman staring down the barrel of losing everything her husband had built, alone with a handful of green hands who couldn't hold a rifle steady between them. I don't have money to hire a gun, Ash. I've got maybe $11 and a mortgage. Dunmore's bank happens to hold half of. I'm not asking you to stay. I know I've got no right to ask a stranger for anything at all. Ash sat with that a long moment, turning his coffee cup slow between his palms, feeling the old rule strain against something newer and stronger that had been building since the moment he'd seen her back pressed flat to that storefront wall, refusing to bend. He thought of all the towns he'd ridden through and out of again, all the trouble he'd stepped around because getting involved meant staying, and staying meant roots, and roots meant something that could be found and burned down by men like the ones he'd left behind him. He thought about riding north in the morning, and never once looking back the way he'd done 100 times before without a second thought. And he found, to his own considerable surprise, that he didn't want to. "I'll stay through the winter," he heard himself say, and the words felt strange and heavy in his mouth, like a debt he was only now realizing he'd always meant to pay. Long enough to see your fence lines held and your hands trained to something better than green. After that, he shrugged, not quite able to finish the sentence, because after that had never once in 11 years been a thought he'd allowed himself. Cora's eyes went bright and wet, and she blinked hard against it, too proud to let a stranger see her cry over a kindness. Why would you do that for a woman you met an hour ago?" Ash weighed the question honestly before he faced it, which was more than he'd given most questions in a very long time. "Because somebody once did the same for me." It was as close to the truth as he'd shared with anyone in years. "And I never got the chance to thank him for it." If a widow trusting her land to a stranger with 2 fast Colt pulls you in, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. Ward traveled fast in a town as small and starved for gossip as Ambergate, and by the time Ash rode into the yard at 2 Rivers the next morning with his few belongings tied behind his saddle, Pete Danvers was 19 and built like a fence rail, all knees and elbows and earnestness, the son of a rancher who'd sold out to Dunmore the year before and stayed on as Cora's only experienced hand out of what he named plain stubborn loyalty. Jimmy Foss was younger still, 17, quick with a joke and slower with a rope, the kind of boy who'd grown up fast because the alternative was starving. And Micah Reyes was the oldest of the 3 at 31, a quiet, careful man who'd lost his own small spread to a banknote 2 winters back and had nowhere else in the world to go. None of them, Ash saw within the first 10 minutes of watching them work, had ever been trained to hold a line against men who meant to kill them. He didn't waste time on speeches. By noon, he had all 3 of them out past the North Corral with rifles they'd owned since childhood, teaching them to breathe before a shot instead of flinching before it, to find cover before they found their targets, to trust the ground and the timber instead of standing exposed in open pride the way green men always did. Pete had the best eye of the 3, but the worst patience. Jimmy had steady hands and no confidence in them. Micah, it turned out, had fought in the war same as Ash had, on the other side of it, and the 2 men reached an understanding without ever needing to discuss the particulars. The quiet fellowship of men who both seen enough of dying to hate teaching it to boys who hadn't. By evening, the 3 of them could hit a fence post at 60 yards more often than not, and something in the set of their shoulders had changed from frightened to merely afraid, which Ash knew from hard experience was as much as you could ask of any man before his first real fight. Fortifying 2 Rivers took the better part of 2 weeks, and Ash worked through all of it like a man racing a clock, only he could hear ticking. He had the hands dig a shallow trench line along the tree break north of the house, screened from view, and deep enough to shelter a man lying flat, with a second fallback trench closer to the porch in case the first line broke. He had them run a rope corral system that could funnel charging horses into a narrow kill zone between the barn and the smokehouse, and he salted the approach with hidden snares and deadfalls that wouldn't kill a man outright but would slow him, unhorse him. He taught Cora herself to load and fire the old Henry rifle that had belonged to her father, and though her hands shook the first dozen times, by the end of that first week she could put 5 rounds into a barrel lid at 80 yards without her breath catching once. Cora watched him work with a wary fascination that slowly, cautiously softened into something else entirely. He was not, she came to realize, simply a man good with a gun. He thought in angles and sight lines and fallback positions the way a rancher thought in seasons and grass, with a fluency built from a life spent surviving by exactly this kind of foresight. One evening, mending fence side by side in a silence that had become comfortable rather than awkward, she wondered aloud where a man learned to think like that. Ash stayed quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. The war taught me some of it. The rest I learned after, in places I don't much like remembering. I had a mentor once, an old soldier who found me half-starved and half mad with grief and taught me there was a way to survive a world that had already taken everything from me. He gave me the skills I chose later, what to do with them. Sometimes I chose poorly. The days settled into a rhythm none of them would have predicted a month before. Mornings began before the sun cleared the ridge. Coffee boiled over the cook fire, while Josiah, still only Ash to every soul at 2 Rivers, walked the fence lines, checking for cut wire and fresh boot prints. Pete learned to read the ground the way Ash did the bent grass and disturbed gravel that told a story hours old, and by the second week he'd spotted a scouting party's tracks along the north boundary before Ash himself noticed them, a small triumph that put a swagger in the boy's walk for a full 3 days. Jimmy's aim never did catch up to Pete's, but his ear for trouble sharpened faster than either of the older men expected, and it was Jimmy who first learned to tell the difference between an owl's real call and a man's poor imitation of one. Micah kept mostly to himself, working the horses and the smokehouse with a competence that needed no supervision. But in the evenings, once the hands had gone quiet with exhaustion, it was Micah who sat longest with Ash by the dying fire, 2 soldiers from opposite sides of a war, finding in each other's silence something like the fellowship they'd both spent years without. She didn't press him further that evening, sensing the door he'd opened, only a crack, wasn't ready to swing wide, but the exchange lodged in her the way small honesties do, and over the following days she found herself watching him not merely as a hired protector. For his part, Ash found himself noticing things about Cora Ledger he had no business noticing in a woman he'd known scarcely 2 weeks. The stubborn line of her jaw when she refused to be talked out of joining the trench crews herself, the surprising gentleness in her hands when she doctored a hand's rope-burned palm. Rare and startled, and entirely unguarded, at a joke Jimmy made one evening over supper, as if she'd forgotten for 1 whole minute that her husband was 6 weeks dead. He reminded himself, each time he noticed, that it changed nothing about his plans to ride on once the danger passed. He believed himself less every time. Everett Dunmore, meanwhile, was not a patient man by nature, and Reed Marlowe's humiliation on the Ambergate street had cost him more than pride. It had cost him the illusion that 2 Rivers remained an easy target. Dunmore ran his operation from a fine brick office above the Ambergate Bank, a building he'd financed himself, and from behind its heavy oak desk he'd built an empire out of other men's desperation. He had connections that ran higher than any rancher in the county suspected, a friendly federal land office clerk who buried the right paperwork and lost the wrong deeds, a state senator named Colby who'd taken enough of Dunmore's money over the years to look the other way on a great many things, and the quiet backing of the Cascade Southern Railroad itself. which cared only that the survey line reached the coast on schedule and raised no uncomfortable questions about how the land along the way came to be cleared. Dunmore summoned Marlowe to his office the evening after the Ambergate incident, and the enforcer stood before the desk nursing a wrist wrapped in stiff bandage, his pride wounded worse than the joint itself. Dunmore didn't bother with preamble, didn't even look up from the ledger he was annotating in a careful, unhurried hand. Marlowe didn't know, plainly. Nobody in town knew, only that he called himself Ash, that he'd ridden in from the south with the look of a man who'd survived worse places than Ambergate, and that he was now bunking at Two Rivers and teaching Cora Ledger's green hands to shoot straight. Dunmore set down his pen at that, and for the first time in the conversation real interest crossed his face. Not concern, not yet, but the calculating attention of a man recalculating odds, a drifter. He weighed the word slowly. Or a gun for hire, playing at chivalry to earn her trust before he asks his price. Either way, it's a complication I don't intend to tolerate. He'd built his fortune on patience and pressure applied at exactly the right pace, never so much force that it drew unwanted attention from the wrong quarters, never so little that his targets found the spine to hold out. Two Rivers was the last significant holdout along the survey line, and the railroad's schedule would not wait forever on his patience. "Give the widow one more week," he instructed Marlowe, watching the man's bandaged wrist with something almost like contempt. "Let her believe her stranger has bought her safety. Then remind her, unmistakably, exactly how temporary that safety is." Marlowe, still smarting, wondered whether that meant they should simply kill the stranger outright and be done with the complication. Dunmore's smile was thin and entirely without warmth. Not yet. A dead drifter draws questions from marshals who might otherwise never think to look this way. A dead barn, on the other hand, draws nothing but sympathy for a widow's terrible misfortune, and one more reason for her to finally see sense and sell. The raid came 11 nights later, under a moon thin enough to hide riders and thick enough to see by, and it came exactly the way Ash had spent 2 weeks preparing for, which was the only reason Two Rivers didn't burn to the ground that night. Micah caught the first sign of it from the north trench a little after midnight, dust rising pale against the dark tree line, too much dust for anything but a body of mounted men moving with purpose, and the warning shot he fired into the sky bought the household perhaps 90 seconds of preparation. Ash was up and moving before the shot's echo died, rousing Cora and the hands with a calm economy of motion that steadied every frightened heart in that house faster than any speech could have. They drilled this a dozen times. Nobody needed telling twice. Dunmore had sent perhaps 14 men that night, more than Ash had expected, and exactly the kind of overwhelming force meant to end resistance in a single decisive stroke, and they came in fast with torches already lit. The first wave hit the outer trench line and found it defended by rifles they hadn't accounted for, and 3 riders went down in the first exchange, unhorsed and scrambling rather than killed outright, because Ash had trained his green hands to aim for horses and shoulders in the confusion of a night fight, to disable rather than to make martyrs. Dunmore could parade before a friendly sheriff, but numbers ruled, and the outer line couldn't hold against 14 determined riders forever. A torch arcs through the dark and caught the barn's dry shake roof, and flame climbed it with a hunger that turned the whole yard the color of a nightmare. Cora didn't hesitate. The barn held 6 horses that represented half of what Two Rivers had left in the world. and before Ash could stop her, she was sprinting through open ground toward the burning structure with nothing but her father's Henry rifle, and a fury that made her fearless in a way that terrified him more. He went after her without a second thought, laying down, covering fire that emptied 2 more saddles as he ran, and together they wrenched the barn doors wide and drove the screaming, panicked horses out into the dark, while flame licked at the rafters above them. They got out with seconds to spare, Cora's sleeve smoldering where an ember had caught it, Ash's hand closing hard around her arm to smother the small flame before it could spread, both of them coughing smoke and alive by a margin narrower than either wanted to think about later. The fight fell back to the house. After that, the hands retreating in good order the way Ash had drilled them, firing and falling back and firing again from the second trench line while the barn collapsed behind them in a roaring pillar of sparks that lit the whole yard like a second sun. It was Ash and Micah who held the porch itself when 3 riders broke through in a final desperate push, and it was there, in close quarters lit orange by the dying barn, that Ambergate would later say Ash truly earned the reputation that would follow him out of that county. 2 Colts, working in a rhythm that looked almost gentle from a distance. Riders emptied from their saddles without a wasted motion, without a single shot fired in anger rather than necessity. When the last of Dunmore's men broke and rode for the tree line, 2 Rivers stood scorched and smoking, but standing, its people bruised and frightened, but every one of them alive, and something in Ash's chest that had been frozen shut for 11 years cracked open a little further, watching Cora Ledger stand in the ruin of half her livelihood, refusing to weep in front of men who needed to see her strong. They spent the next 2 days rebuilding what could be rebuilt and mourning what couldn't, and it was in the exhausted, tender quiet of the second evening, both of them scrubbing soot from their hands at the pump behind the house, that Cora finally put the question to him she'd been holding since the barn fire. "Why do you really care what happens to this ranch, Ash? You could have ridden out after that first fight in town, and nobody would have thought less of you for it." He stayed quiet a long moment, working a stubborn streak of ash from beneath his thumbnail, before he met it honestly for the first time since he had arrived. "Because I watched a man like Dunmore take everything from people I loved once." Voice low and rough, in a way she'd never heard from him, and I was too young and too green to stop it. I've spent 11 years making sure I was never that helpless again. I couldn't watch it happen twice and just ride away, Cora. Not when I finally had the means to stop it. Cora studied his face in the fading light, and whatever she saw there, the old grief beneath the new resolve, the careful walls of a man who'd learned the hard way not to let anyone close enough to hurt him again, softened something in her own guarded heart. "I'm glad you didn't ride away." She reached out to still his restless hands with her own, an ordinary gesture that felt between the 2 of them like considerably more than that. Both of them understood without needing the words that something had shifted between them that neither of the rules Ash had lived by for 11 years had ever accounted for, and that whatever came next at 2 Rivers, they were going to face it together rather than as a hired gun and the widow who'd hired him. Those 2 days after, the raid found 2 Rivers a place of quiet, aching work. Cora dressed a graze along Pete's forearm with hands that had gone steady with practice she'd never wanted, and Micah splinted a dislocated finger Jimmy had earned wrestling a panicked colt free of a snare line, wincing and grinning through the pain in equal measure because he was, after all, still alive to feel it. The barn's black skeleton smoked for 2 more days, a scar visible clear from the ridge road, and more than one Ambergate rancher rode out that week under cover of errand and excuse. And to quietly leave a sack of nails or a coil of rope by the porch without ever admitting he'd come to check. Word of that night traveled the county faster than any newspaper, and for the first time since Sam Ledger's death. The whispers in Ambergate ran not toward pity for a doomed widow, but toward something that looked cautiously like hope. On the third morning after the raid, an old man rode out to Two Rivers on a mule so ancient it seemed held together mostly by stubbornness, and introduced himself to Ash as Tuck Halloway, formerly the county's deputy marshal, retired 8 years now, and living quiet on a small parcel south of town. He'd heard about the fight the way everybody in Ambergate had by breakfast, and he'd come to offer what an old lawman with bad knees and a long memory could still give a fight he'd wanted to join. I watched Dunmore build this whole rotten operation from the ground up, Tuck explained, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of Cora's coffee warming his hands. I watched Sheriff Boone take his money and look the other way, and I was too old and too alone to do a damn thing about it. I'm not too old to help you finish it, though, if you'll have an old man's knowledge instead of his gun hand. What Tuck brought them was worth considerably more than a steady trigger finger. He knew, from years of quiet watching, exactly where Dunmore's crooked lawyer, a nervous, overfed man named Higgins, kept the paper trail of every fraudulent deed transfer, every falsified survey report, every payment routed to Sheriff Boone and to a senator in the Capitol who'd been selling his office by degrees for the better part of a decade. Proof enough to hang the whole operation, Tuck judged. If a man could get inside that office and walk out again, with the right ledgers, before anybody noticed they were gone. It was Ash who volunteered without hesitation, and Tuck who pressed to come along despite his knees, arguing that 30 years of knowing Ambergate's back alleys and loose window latches were worth more than youth in a job that called for quiet over speed. They went in 2 nights later, past midnight, through a rear window Tuck remembered had never locked properly in the decade he'd walked that beat, and found Higgins's office exactly as promised, packed with ledgers whose entries laid out the whole ugly story in Dunmore's own careful handwriting. Payments to Boone dated back 3 years. Correspondence with Senator Colby discussing survey routes drawn to favor land Dunmore had already quietly acquired through intimidation. And, worst of all, buried in a private correspondence folder Tuck nearly missed entirely, a letter in Dunmore's own hand to Marlowe, dated the week before Sam Ledger's death, instructing him in language careful enough to survive a courtroom but clear enough to any honest reader. Ash read that letter twice in the dim lamplight of Higgins's office, and something cold and absolutely certain settled into his chest where the anger had been. This was the proof Cora had spent 6 weeks praying somebody would find. They rode back to Two Rivers with the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the floorboard of Tuck's wagon, and when Ash laid the letter about Sam's death on the kitchen table before Cora, the following morning he watched grief and vindication, watched her read her husband's murder confirmed in black ink, and somehow find, beneath the fresh wave of loss, a kind of terrible relief that she hadn't imagined the wrongness of it after all. "I need you to hear this next part clear," Ash urged gently, once she'd had a moment to compose herself. "This proof is worth nothing, sitting in a farmhouse. We need a federal man, somebody outside Boone's pocket, and outside whatever reach Colby has in this county, and we need to hand it to him in a way Dunmore can't simply burn down or buy off before it ever reaches a judge. If watching Cora and Josiah build something worth defending pulls you in, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. It helps these stories keep coming. Getting the Ledgers safely out of the county took a caution neither man had needed the night they'd stolen them. Dunmore's riders now watched the roads out of Ambergate in both directions, certain something had shifted even if they couldn't yet say what, and Ash and Tuck spent 2 full days moving the oilcloth-wrapped bundle in stages, hidden first in a false-bottomed feed barrel at 2 Rivers. Then carried by a trusted neighbor's wagon to a line shack 8 miles south, then finally entrusted to Micah, whose quiet, unremarkable presence on the road drew no second glance from anyone, to carry the last leg himself. It was nerve-wracking work for men who preferred a straight fight to this kind of patient smuggling, and more than once Ash caught himself checking the tree line out of old habit, half expecting Marlowe's riders to come boiling out of the timber at any bend in the road. They didn't. The Ledgers reached 2 Rivers whole and untouched, and only then did the real work begin. Tuck knew the name of a federal marshal working the territory's land fraud complaints out of the capital, a careful, incorruptible man named Elias Doyle, who'd already, unknown to any of them, begun quietly investigating a pattern of suspicious ranch sales along the Cascade Southern survey line after 2 other families filed complaints that never seemed to reach anyone with the authority to act on them. It took 4 days of careful roundabout messaging to reach him without alerting Boone or anyone in Dunmore's pay, and when Marshal Doyle finally rode into 2 Rivers under cover of a supply run that raised no suspicion, he read through Tuck's stolen ledgers with the grim, unsurprised expression of a man confirming a suspicion he'd carried for months rather than discovering a new one. This is enough to indict him, Doyle judged, once he'd finished. More than enough, if we can get it in front of a judge who isn't answering to Colby, but paper alone won't move fast enough to stop him from destroying the rest of it or fleeing before we can act. I need him caught doing something he can't argue away in a courtroom, in front of witnesses he can't buy or intimidate into silence. The plan they built together over the following 2 days was dangerous in a way that made Ash's stomach tighten every time he considered the part of it that required Cora herself to serve as the bait, though he argued against it fiercely and lost the argument entirely, because Cora Ledger had spent 6 weeks being protected and had decided, with the same stubborn spine that had refused Dunmore's men on an Ambergate street, that she would not spend the final act of this fight hiding behind anyone else's courage. Dunmore, Doyle explained, was too careful a man to incriminate himself on paper twice, but he was also, by every account they'd gathered, a man whose pride couldn't resist a chance to gloat over a beaten opponent, particularly if that opponent appeared to be finally humiliatingly ready to surrender. Cora sent word into town that she wished to discuss selling 2 Rivers, after all. Worn down at last by grief and fire and fear, and requested that Dunmore himself come to the ranch to finalize terms rather than making her travel into a town crawling with his men. It was, Doyle judged correctly, exactly the kind of victory Dunmore's vanity wouldn't resist attending in person, particularly with the extra satisfaction of seeing the troublesome drifter. Doyle and 2 federal deputies would conceal themselves in the barn's rebuilt loft, and the tree line beyond the yard, close enough to hear every word and near enough to move fast the moment Dunmore put himself on record, plainly enough to hang him with his own mouth rather than merely his ledgers. Everett Dunmore rode out to 2 Rivers 3 days later with Reed Marlowe and 4 armed men flanking him, dressed in a fine gray suit, entirely unsuited to ranch country, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd finally won a contest he'd never once doubted the outcome of. He found Cora waiting on the porch steps, composed and dry-eyed in a way that cost her considerably more than it appeared to, with Ash standing a careful, deliberately unthreatening distance behind her, hands loose, expression unreadable. Mrs. Ledger. Dunmore removed his hat with a courtesy that felt like mockery. "I confess I'm relieved you've finally come to your senses. It would have grieved me terribly to see any further unfortunate accidents befall this lovely property." Cora's voice shook only slightly in response, and every tremor in it was calculated to sound like defeat rather than the fury actually driving it. "I want to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to, Mr. Dunmore, before I sign anything away. My husband died on this land. I want to know, plainly, that whatever happened to him won't happen to anyone else who crosses you." Dunmore's smile didn't waver, and that was precisely the arrogance Doyle had counted on. "Your husband's death was a tragic accident, Mrs. Ledger." His tone stayed smooth, and then, unable to resist the small cruelty of the moment, added the words that would end him. "Though I'll admit, a man who insists on standing in the way of progress for as long as Sam Ledger did tends to find accidents come looking for him rather more often than caution alone would suggest. You'd do well to remember that yourself, and to remember it faster than he did." The words hung in the yard's still afternoon air, plain enough that no lawyer alive could argue them away as anything but the confession they were. And Marshal Doyle stepped out from the barn's shadow with his badge raised and his deputies fanning out behind him. "Everett Dunmore," Doyle's voice carried flat and hard across the yard. "You're under federal arrest for land fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Samuel Ledger." For one frozen second, the whole yard held its breath, Dunmore's face draining of color as understanding hit him. And then Marlowe, closest to panic and always quickest to violence, went for his gun. What followed lasted perhaps 20 seconds and felt, to everyone who lived through it, considerably longer. Marlowe's shot went wide as Ash's hand found his own Colt in a motion too fast to properly see, and the enforcer went down with a wound to the shoulder that ended his part in the fight without ending his life. Because Ash had spent 11 years learning exactly how much force a moment required, and had no interest in making a martyr Dunmore's remaining allies could later use against Cora. Two of Dunmore's other men made the same mistake and paid similarly, disabled rather than killed, while Doyle's deputies moved fast and disciplined to disarm the rest before the exchange could spiral into the kind of massacre nobody in that yard. Dunmore himself, when the smoke cleared, was found cowering behind his own fine carriage, hands raised. Every ounce of his careful composure stripped away and replaced with the naked panic of a man realizing, far too late, that money and connections had finally run out of road. They took him into federal custody that same afternoon along with Marlowe once a doctor had seen to his shoulder, and, within the week, the Ledgers, Ash and Tuck had stolen from Higgins's office, had done exactly what Doyle promised they would, and reached far enough up the chain to cost Senator Colby his seat, and very nearly his liberty, though his lawyers would spend a long, expensive year arguing him down to disgrace rather than a cell. Everett Dunmore himself faced a federal judge 3 months later on charges that ranged from land fraud to conspiracy to murder, and though his money bought him better lawyers than most men facing such charges could ever afford, the Ledgers and the Marshal's own testimony to what he'd heard on that porch left no honest jury any real doubt. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, his fortune seized and distributed in restitution to every family whose land he'd stolen or whose kin he'd harmed along the way. Ambergate changed in the months that followed in ways nobody who'd lived through that dying summer would have predicted. The families who'd sold out under threat found their sales voided and their land returned, and several who'd left the county entirely came trickling back once word spread that Dunmore's reach had finally completely broken. New families arrived, too, drawn by land made suddenly affordable, and a county whose worst danger had been publicly, permanently removed. Sheriff Boone's replacement, appointed with Doyle's personal recommendation, was a careful, honest man who bore no resemblance whatsoever to his predecessor, and slowly the town began repainting its storefronts and repairing its leaning steeple, not because anyone forced it to, but because a place. At Two Rivers, the barn rose again over that autumn and winter, bigger and better braced than the one that had burned, built by neighbors who'd once been strangers and hands who'd become something closer to family. And through all of it, Ash stayed. He reasoned with himself in the first weeks after Dunmore's arrest that he was only seeing the rebuilding through before he finally honored the second rule and rode north the way he always had. But the weeks became a season, and the season became something neither he nor Cora named directly for a long while, both of them circling a truth they'd each separately come to believe, but hadn't yet found the courage to name aloud, not after so much loss, not without being entirely certain the other felt it too. It was Cora, in the end, who found the courage first, on an evening in early spring, when the new barn stood finished and gold with fresh-cut lumber, and the whole ranch smelled of turned earth and cottonwood coming into bud. She found Ash sitting on the corral fence watching the horses graze in the long light, the same restless stillness in him she'd noticed that very first evening, a man perpetually half-braced to leave even when every part of him plainly didn't want to. "You've stayed through winter." She climbed up onto the rail beside him. That was the deal, wasn't it? Through winter, and then whatever came after. Ash didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice carried a rawness she'd never once heard from him, not even in the worst hours of the siege. "I don't know how to stay anywhere, Cora," he confessed. "I've spent 11 years making sure I never had to. Rootless is safer. Rootless means nobody can ever take anything from you again, because you never let yourself have anything worth taking in the first place." "And now?" she asked quietly. Though her heart was pounding hard enough, she was certain he could hear it now. He turned to face her fully for the first time in that conversation, something long buried finally breaking loose in his expression. "I think I'd rather have something worth losing than spend the rest of my life making sure I never do." He reached into his coat then and drew out a small, worn photograph he'd carried folded in oilcloth for over a decade, protected through every town and every winter and every fight, and held it out to her with hands that worked quite steady. "My name isn't Ash. It never was. I took that name 11 years ago because the man I'd been died the same night my family did, and I wasn't sure I had any right to carry his name forward into the life I chose after. My real name is Josiah Crane." Cora took the photograph gently, a faded image of a young man who bore Ash's same steady eyes standing beside two people who could only have been his parents, and understood, without needing every detail explained that evening, that he'd just handed her the whole of what remained of his old life, the very last thing he had left to give. Josiah Crane. She tested the name's weight softly in her mouth, like something precious. "I like it. It suits you better than Ash ever did." He laughed low and unguarded, a sound she realized she'd never once heard from him before that moment, and reached for her hand, and neither of them let go of the other for a very long time after that. The wedding itself was a small, unhurried affair by any city's standard, and the finest thing Ambergate had seen in a decade by its own. Cora wore her mother's ivory dress, let out at the seams by a neighbor woman with a steady needle, and carried a bundle of late summer wildflowers Jimmy had ridden 2 hours to gather from the high meadow. Josiah stood beneath the cottonwoods in a borrowed dark coat that fit him poorly through the shoulders and didn't matter in the least, his 2 Colts left inside on the kitchen table for the first time anyone at Two Rivers could remember, as if he'd finally trusted the world enough to stand in it unarmed. A circuit preacher who happened through Ambergate that same week agreed to stay an extra day for the honor of it, and half the county turned out uninvited, drawn by a story that had already, in the space of one hard winter, become the kind ranch families would tell their children for years to come. They married that summer in the yard at Two Rivers, beneath the same cottonwoods where Cora had once stood watching a stranger break a stubborn man's wrist to defend her, surrounded by every soul who'd fought alongside them through that terrible winter, Pete and Jimmy and Micah, none of them green any longer. Tuck Halloway, proud and upright in a borrowed suit, Marshal Doyle, come all the way from the capital to stand as witness to a story he'd helped finish. Josiah Crane, who had ridden into Ambergate a nameless drifter, meaning to stay one night and be gone by morning, stood instead in the yard of the ranch he'd helped save, married the widow whose courage had cracked open a heart he'd sealed shut for 11 long years. Watching Cora laugh unguarded and radiant in the golden afternoon light, that the rule he'd broken that first day on an Ambergate street hadn't cost him anything at all. It had given him back the only thing worth having that he'd thought he'd lost forever, a place and a person worth finally staying for. Stories like Josiah and Cora's don't get made without you. Become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and stay for whatever we're telling next. They kept Two Rivers whole for the rest of their days, and the ranch grew the way land always grows once it's finally free of somebody's grasping shadow over it, new fences, new foals born each spring, new hands hired on not out of desperation, drawn by a spread with a reputation for fairness that had traveled further than either owner ever realized. Pete stayed on as foreman within 3 years, steady and capable in a way that would have startled the anxious, all-knees boy who'd first met Josiah across a rifle training line. Jimmy left eventually to start his own small spread 2 counties over, carrying Josiah's training and Cora's kindness with him into a life neither of them had once thought a scared 17-year-old orphan would live to see. Micah never left at all, content in a way he confided to Josiah once, something he hadn't believed himself capable of feeling again after the war and the banknote both, and became in time less a hired hand than simply family. Tuck Halloway lived another 11 good years past that spring, long enough to see Ambergate rebuild itself into a town that no longer flinched at the mention of a land baron's name, long enough to bounce more than one of Cora and Josiah's children on his knee and tell them the whole long story of how a nameless gunman and a stubborn widow had broken the worst man the county had ever produced. Marshal Doyle went on to a long, distinguished career rooting out exactly the kind of corruption that had nearly buried Two Rivers. And he never forgot, he'd say in later years, that the case that made his reputation had started with an old retired deputy's stubborn refusal to stop caring about a fight he had every excuse to walk away from. Everett Dunmore served every one of his 25 years, and by the time a much older, much diminished man walked free of federal prison, The empire he'd built on other people's fear and grief had been so thoroughly dismantled and redistributed. He died alone some years later in a rented room in a city that had long since forgotten his name, and if there was any justice in that quiet, friendless ending, it was a justice built not on vengeance but on the simple fact that every family whose land he'd stolen had gotten it back, whole and clear, while he'd gotten nothing at all but the long, empty accounting of what his cruelty had actually cost him. As for Josiah Crane, the man who had once been Ash, who had ridden into 100 dying towns over 11 rootless years and ridden back out of every single one without looking back, he never left Ambergate again. He raised 3 children at 2 Rivers with a wife whose courage had first stopped him cold on a dusty street outside a mercantile, and he let them know, when they were old enough to ask why their father wore 2 matched Colts even long after the county had gone peaceful and safe, that a man carries the tools of his old life not because he expects to need them again, but because they remind him exactly how far he traveled to find the life he has now. He'd broken a rule that had kept him alive for 11 years the day he stepped between Cora Ledger and 2 of Everett Dunmore's men, and it remained, for the whole of his long and finally settled life, the single best decision he ever made. The Nameless Gunman had ridden into Ambergate, looking for nothing but supplies and an empty road north. He rode out of that chapter of his life with a name, again a home and a family, worth every risk he'd ever taken to keep them safe, and if that isn't the kind of ending this hard country owes its bravest and most stubborn hearts,